Hey guys, it's Courtney. Happy 4th of July to everyone. Today we are going to be making a 4th of July themed card. So I'm using the Lady Liberty stamp set as well as the Layered Fireworks stencil, which this is part of the brand new release. I'm starting off with a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. This is cut down to an A2 size card. Going to bring out my Misty, and I'm just going to be stamping my little Lady Liberty towards the bottom right there in the center of my card panel. I am stamping with Memento Tuxedo Black ink because I will be Copic coloring her, but the main focus will actually be the background of the card. So once she is all stamped out, I'm going to take a piece of Simon Says Stamp masking paper, which is a super tacky masking paper. So you're going to want to use something that has a lot of stick to it for this particular technique. You will want to try your best to make sure that it is lined up the best you can. We will probably not line it up perfect, but we will fix that in the end. But the closer it is, the better it is, the easier it will be in the end, I should say. So next we're going to go ahead and work on the background, and we're going to be using some Distress Oxides here. I'm using Stormy Sky, Faded Jeans, Chip Sapphire, and Black Soot. I'm bringing out some Trinity Stamps blending brushes here, and I'm going to start with my lightest color towards the bottom and kind of work up to the top being my darkest. I want this to end up being a really dark, rich background. So I'm kind of building up my color. So I'm going on to the the Faded Jeans next, and then going back in with that Stormy Sky to make sure that those two colors are blended well. Then moving on to the Chipped Sapphire, and initially I didn't go right to the top with the Chipped Sapphire and tried to put that Black Soot on the very top. But I don't know about you guys, but my Black Soot for the Distress Oxide is not truly black. So I was having a hard time blending those. I find that the regular Distress inks for the Black Soot is a lot darker. But in order to fix that, I ended up going back in with the Chipped Sapphire and bringing that all the way to the top of the panel, then adding the Black Soot directly over that and just bringing that down a little bit. And then you'll see once I have that done, I'm going to work in reverse and go back down to the bottom portion of my card panel, kind of just making sure that all of these blues and the Black Soot blend together nicely and I have more of a seamless blend. I am using a scrap piece of paper to kind of rest my fingers on so that I don't leave fingerprints. Distress Oxides do take a long time to dry because they kind of sit on the surface of the paper, so it's easy to leave fingerprints. So once I was happy with the blend and I had the intensity of color I was looking for, I did let my panel sit for a little bit, probably about 15 minutes or so before moving on to the next step, just to make sure that my ink was completely dry. Once that was dry, I am going to go ahead and bring out that fireworks stencil, and I'm bringing out the first layer, and I'm going to be using more Distress Oxides as well as a white pigment ink. And you can certainly use any pigment ink, but you will want to make sure it's pigment ink because they are opaque. So I'm taking the first layer of the stencil, and it doesn't matter which layer you use first. You can use either one. Using some Post-it note tape just to make sure that this doesn't move around when I apply my ink. And I'm going to bring out some more blending brushes here. And I'm not really rubbing on the color because I don't want to pick up the blue. I just want to add the color on top of the background we've already created. Because the oxides are somewhat opaque, they're not as opaque as traditional pigment inks, but I don't have a whole lot of pigment ink, so I went with the Distress Oxides. It will kind of sit on top of the blue background that we've created, and the colors will shine through. They will not be as vibrant as they would be if we just put this on white cardstock, but they will definitely shine through. So I used the Squeezed Lemonade, Carved Pumpkin. Now we're going to move on to the Candied Apple. And I found that the little teeny tiny blending brushes were a lot easier to use. I guess you could probably use like a finger dauber too, but I don't own any of those. So this was the next best thing. Again, just kind of dabbing on that color, making sure that I'm filling in all of the little gaps on the stencil. Some of them are pretty tiny and it's kind of hard to see because of our background being so dark. So you kind of might have to twist and turn the paper just to make sure that you have all of those the little openings of the stencil completely filled in, and that the color is not going to kind of mix in with that blue. If you rub this, not only is it going to blend with the blue, but it's going to bleed outside of those little stencil lines. So once I had those colors down, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the white pigment ink. And this is the Unicorn Pigment Ink by Hero Arts, but you can use any white pigment ink for this. Going to bring another one of these smaller stencil brushes or the blending brushes here and just fill in that last firework there. I'm not worried about the one that's, I guess it would be behind Lady Liberty, because I don't want to add too much to my mask. I don't want to add too much moisture to my mask. So I'm kind of avoiding that one. I'm just kind of skipping that one. So again, I'm going to go ahead and remove my stencil and clean these off immediately. And I'm going to let this sit for about another 15 minutes before moving on to the next step. Like I said, these pigment inks and these oxides kind of just lay on top of the paper. So you need to make sure it's completely dry before adding anything else. So once that was dry, we're going to move on to the next layer of the stencil. And these are super easy to line up. The blue background, the dark background makes it a little bit more difficult, but there's kind of, I don't know whether you guys can see it, but there's a little bit of etching on the stencil, so you can kind of see through and line these up perfectly. Kind of like a layering stamp, only it's a stencil. Going to stick this down again with some Post-it note tape so it doesn't move around. And next we're going to bring out some Glimmer Paste by Nuvo. And I have just a palette knife here, and I'm just going to apply this over the stencil, kind of making sure that it's somewhat even. And this is kind of a little bit textured, so it's kind of easy to apply. And this will kind of give layers to the fireworks and give a little bit of sparkle, of course. So you want to remove your stencil and clean that off along with your palette knife immediately, because this does dry fairly quickly. I did give the texture paste or the glimmer paste probably about 2 hours or so to completely dry before removing my mask for my image. When you remove your mask, especially when you do have a ton of moisture on it from the Distress Inks and from the Glimmer Paste, you need to be super, super careful. So I'm using the tip of my scissors to kind of get that started, and I'm very, very slowly peeling it off. If my mask starts to rip in certain areas, I'm just letting it rip, and I'll go back to those teeny tiny areas later. I don't want to risk ripping my actual cardstock, so you'll see that I'm just working in teeny tiny pieces here. So once that was completely removed, we're going to move on to the Copic coloring, which I kept very, very simple. Obviously, the Statue of Liberty is all the same color. So it felt a little bit strange adding some shading on her face and her hair, all the same color. But it only took a few minutes to color this. Now, normally I go in with my lightest color to saturate the paper and to mark out the darkest areas or my shadow areas, but in this particular case I'm going directly in with my darkest color first, because I don't want to saturate the paper too much. The more you saturate the paper, the more you risk the colors bleeding outside the lines, and I don't want that to happen because I'm never going to be able to take it up with that background that we have going on. So by going in with my darkest color, I'm adding less ink to the paper, and that will kind of minimize my chances of it bleeding. So you can see that I'm adding shading here underneath where her hair is hanging over her face. Her hair is kind of wavy a little bit or layered a little bit. So I'm creating a shadow there. Also creating a shadow within the folds of her clothing. The lines are right within the illustration, so I'm just using those to my advantage as far as where I need to put that shading. I am coloring in her torch, but you can see the flame on her torch. I am not coloring. I'm going to end up coloring that with a different color combination. I'm also adding a shading or a shadow where her hand is holding the torch, as well as where her clothing is kind of draped over itself. I just blended that out with the darkest midtone there, and next moving on to the G02, which is my lightest midtone, and I'm just extending these areas out a little bit further. I am leaving a fairly large highlight, a little bit larger than I typically do, just because I felt that G07 was a little bit too dark, even though I like to use those scary dark colors to get that contrast. She's definitely not the star of the show when it comes to this card. I want my fireworks to be, so I don't need to concentrate on the coloring being absolutely perfect. So finally, I'm going to go in with my G0 or G00, and I'm going to blend all of these areas out. And like I said, leaving that larger highlight area. I am coloring directly over her face completely. I'm not adding any kind of detail to her face, because if you look at the Statue of Liberty, it doesn't have any detail to her face. It is all one color. So it is a little bit of a jump between the G00 and the G02, but going over it just a couple of times, I was able to blend that out pretty well. For the flame on her torch, I am going to use 3 different colors, a red, an orange, and a yellow, but you'll notice that the colors that I chose, the last number is either the same or similar to the one that I used prior. That means these colors will blend very nicely. So again, going directly in with the darkest color, which is that R35, blending that out with the orangish color, and then finally finishing it off with the yellow. Next, I do have a few little gaps where my mask was, which I kind of figured would happen because this is a little bit intricate, especially towards the top of the image. I'm just going to take a marker here that closely matches the background and just lightly fill in those areas with just the very tip of my marker. I typically start with a lighter one, and if I need to go a little bit darker, I will, but this seemed to work out pretty well. So next I'm going to move on to the sentiment, and I kind of played around with the placement of this. I didn't leave myself a whole lot of room for the sentiment, so I'm going to create a sentiment strip. I'm taking a piece of black cardstock, treating that with my anti-static tool, and then I will stamp out the sentiment with some embossing ink, sprinkling on some white embossing powder and heat setting that, making sure that my heat gun is completely heated up. This will minimize the warping and making trimming down into a tiny little strip a little bit easier. And now, because my sentiment strip is black and my background is so dark, it kind of blended in too much. It didn't really pop out. So in order to make my sentiment pop a little bit, I am going to take a white piece of cardstock and I'm going to layer that and create just a tiny little bit of a border for my sentiment strip. I'm going to glue down my sentiment strip right down in the corner, again just leaving a little bit of a border, and then I'm just going to take my scissors and trim out the other 2 sides. You can certainly bring in your paper trimmer for this, but it was just as easy for me to take my scissors. And I'm going to pop this up with some Scotch foam tape right there in the center, being careful not to cover up too much of my fireworks. And last, added a little bit of sparkle with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen to the flame of her torch. And that is it. That is the card for today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Trinity channel. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day.